Colonial women were treated as inferior beings and were afforded little to no rights. Women in southern colonies generally had more rights than northern women due to the fragility of southern families. Although women were restricted in the colonial era, they still found ways to challenge their role in society. Anne Hutchinson challenged Puritan orthodoxy with a belief known as antinomianism, which claimed that the truly saved did not need to obey the law of God or man. She was tried and banished in 1638 for heresy. The Salem witch trials were directed at property-owning women in the colonies. The hysteria reflected the fears of religious traditionalists.
The Revolutionary War was an era of not only freedom for the colonists, but also an increase in social mobility for women. Women began to make names for themselves through impressive actions and large contributions to the American Revolution. Betsy Ross sewed together the American flag to boost the morale of the soldiers and legitimize their reason for fighting. Molly Pitcher was another woman involved in the war efforts. She had been cooking at the camps during the Battle of Monmouth, and when her husband was shot, she took up his post at a nearby cannon. Her actions displayed how women were capable of fighting alongside men. Daughters of Liberty worked with the Sons of Liberty to protest the Stamp Act using violent methods. They drew some attention to the power and influence women could have in politics.
Although women during the Revolutionary period were gaining greater roles in society, they were still far from being accepted as equals. For example, the Declaration of Independence stated that all men were created equal and made no mention of women. Abigail Adams was a prominent feminist known for her intelligence and political knowledge. She once said that the ladies were determined to foment a rebellion of their own if they were not given political rights. Republican motherhood represented the selfless devotion of a mother to her family. It gave women more educational opportunities because of the belief that an educated woman could better raise her children and care for her husband. Sally Hemings had sexual relations with Thomas Jefferson and was one of many other female slaves who were taken advantage of by their white masters.
The mid-1800s were a time of rising economic independence for women as more factory jobs were created. The Lowell girls were mostly single New England farm girls who worked in grueling conditions at the Lowell textile mills. Upon marriage, most women left their jobs and became full-time wives and mothers, wrapped in a cult of domesticity that glorified the housewife's position. However, women were already experiencing lower fertility rates and were experimenting with primitive contraceptives.
Women were a major force in the reform movements of the Second Great Awakening. Dorothea Dix worked to improve the treatment of the mentally ill and led the penal and asylum reform movement. The women's movement also gained ground. Feminists like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony advocated suffrage for women. Lucy Stone kept her maiden name after marriage and was a strong advocate for bloomers. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Blackwell became the first female graduate from a medical school. The modern women's rights movement began when feminists met at Seneca Falls in a women's rights convention, where Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments that declared all men and women are created equal. Several utopian societies arose during the religious revival of the Second Great Awakening. One of them, the Oneida Community, practiced free love, birth control, and eugenics. A woman called Mother Ann Lee founded the Shakers, who had monastic ideals prohibiting marriage and sexual relations. Famous women writers during this time were poet Emily Dixon and Lucia May Alcott. Alcott's book, Little Women, remains popular to this day.
Sojourner Truth was born into slavery, but she escaped and went on to advocate abolitionism and women's rights. Harriet Tubman helped thousands of slaves escape on the Underground Railroad and later fought for women's suffrage. Harriet Beecher Stowe changed history when she published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. President Lincoln called her the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war. When Civil War finally broke out, women also took part as spies, abolitionists, women, soldiers, and nurses. Sarah Barton helped transform nursing into a respected position for women during the Civil War and founded the American Red Cross in 1881.
Gibson Girls are propagandic magazine images of the new ideal of the independent working woman in the late 1800s that inspired new standards of female fashion. Jane Addams was the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She was also the founder of Hull House, which served the poor, providing them with food, shelter, and eventually health care.
In 1899, Florence Kelley reestablished the National Consumers League, which limited the working hours of women and children. She was a strong supporter of women's suffrage and was very important in the fight to improve women's working conditions. Victoria Woodhull's belief in free love launched the new morality, which encouraged sexual freedom, higher divorce rates, birth control, and frank discussion of sexual topics. The Women's Christian Temperance Union grew out of the Women's Crusade. It was for women who believed alcohol was the destructive force and cause of social family problems. It promoted total abstinence. Carrie A. Nation was an American temperance leader who was known for using an axe to demolish bars. She was also an advocate for women's suffrage. Frances E. Willard was one of the most prominent social reformers of the 19th century. She was president of the WCTU for 19 years and supported all other women's suffrage reforms. M. Jackson wrote A Century of Dishonor, which discussed the experiences of Native Americans in the U.S., mostly focused on the injustices they faced. She was crucial to the improved treatment of Native Americans. Ida B. Wells was an African-American journalist, newspaper editor, suffrage, and leader in the civil rights movement. Ida M. Tarbell was a leading force in American journalism. She was a leading muckraker and worked to expose the corrupt oil business.
Muller v. Oregon protected women workers by stating that factory labor had harmful effects on the frailer bodies of women. This argument seems discriminatory by today's standards, but this landmark case began the modern American welfare state.
Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was the deadliest industrial disaster in New York history. 146 women were killed because their boss had locked all the exits. This fire led to the safety standards and the fight for better working conditions. Women's efforts in the temperance movement led to the passage of the 18th Amendment, which abolished demon rum.
Alice Paul founded the National Women's Party and led a successful campaign for women's suffrage that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment. The suffragist movement lasted for more than a century, and in 1920, women won the right to vote. Margaret Sanger openly championed contraceptives and led the birth control movement. Eleanor Roosevelt was America's most active First Lady and commanded enormous popularity and influence. She was the champion of the dispossessed and the conscience of the New Deal.
Secretary of Labor Perkins became America's first female cabinet member. An important figure in women's political history, she was often sneered at by sexist male businessmen. Rosie the Riveter represented American women who worked in factories in World War II. She is commonly used as a symbol of feminism and women's economic power. WACs were non-combat women in the Army who served as arms carriers along with WAVES, the Navy, and SPARS, the Coast Guard. They exemplified rising opportunities for women and some women in minority groups. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystic sparked the second wave of American feminism in the 20th century. She founded the National Organization for Women in 1966, now aimed to bring women into American society in fully equal partnership with men.
Roe v. Wade was a Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion. Rosa Parks, an NAACP secretary, refused to give up her seat to a white woman and was arrested, sparking a year-long black boycott of the city buses. Rachel Carson gave the environmental movement a big push when she published Silent Spring in 1962. It exposed the poisonous effect of pesticides. Carson is the mother of modern conservative movement.
One of the major legislative victories of the feminist movement, the ERA, declared that denial or abridgment of equal rights under the law on account of sex was illegal. Phyllis Schlafly was a woman anti-feminist who campaigned to stop the ERA and was successful in killing it in 1982. She argued that the ERA would undermine the American family. Planned Parenthood v. Casey ruled that restricted access to abortion was legal if they did not place undue burden on the woman. It partly overturned Roe v. Wade. The Million Mom March demonstrated public support for restrictive gun laws and the growing power of women's voices in modern society.
Hillary Clinton ran for president, and even though she didn't win, she now serves as Secretary of State under current President Barack Obama. This demonstrates the progress of women in politics.